Gewaltig. Zok the Heilige Gemara. I'm not sure why I can't hear you, but it looks to me like you're on mute. I'm not sure if you know how to unmute yourself, and I'm not sure if you know how to turn the camera on. If you do.
Morning, Yosy.
Oh, good morning. Now you're unmuted. Okay, gewaltig. Let's see the Heilige Gemara. We are up to Tonu Rabbanon, that's halfway down on Daf Nun Zayin Amud Aleph. Tonu Rabbanon. Ilu Nemar Asher Takrivu Hashem Lo Yisei Chametz. So let's look at the psukim inside, so we have a better idea of what's going on. It says Kol HaMincha Asher Takrivu Hashem. All the menachos that you're going to be makriv, Lo Yisei Chametz. Don't make them chametz. Yichol Zahar B'chol Davash Lo Yisei Aktir Mimenu Isha Hashem. So if it would only say Zok Tehillah Gabraisa, if it would only say Asher Takrivu Hashem Lo Yisei Chametz, I would have said, Ainli Beloisase Chametz ala Chametz Bilvad. It says in the pasuk, what part of the mincha cannot be Chametz? The part Asher Takrivu Hashem. This is the Chametz. Mincha minayin. How do you know before the Chametz, while you're preparing the mincha, when it's the whole thing mixed together? How do you know that also cannot be Chametz? Tamad Laimar mincha. This pasuk is speaking about the minchas marcheshes. So, frek the Gemara shar menachos minayin. How do you know this halach applies even to shar menachos? Tamad kol hamincha asher takrivu Hashem. Zok the Breisabaiter, Kshera. This only applies to a mincha that's kosher. You're going to be makriv it. V'loi psula. If the mincha was possible for any other reason, the iser of making it chametz does not apply. Mikan amru. From here we learn, hamachmet esak kshera chayiv. If someone makes a mincha that's kshera chametz, he will be chayiv. But v'esa psula potter. If the mincha is possible anyway, it's potter. Let's see if Rashi gives examples of what a mincha psula would be. So Rashi could go to yotzes or nitmas. Either it was yotzei, so it became possible yotzei, it left the confines of the Asara, or if it became tamei. If that happened to the mincha, there's no longer allowed to make it chametz. Gewaltig. Boy Rav Papa, Frank Rav Papa, very interesting shaila. What would be? We know if you were mechametz it and then you did it the second time, you're going to be chayiv, right? So if you're chametz in delisha, there's a lav, and then if you continue to do aricha, there's a lav, and if you do afir, there's a lav. So what would be if it was chimtza, and after it was chimtza v'yotzes, it became possible yotzek, and then v'chazer v'chimtza a second time. Mahu, what would be the halacha? Even the yotzes of sila lo v'yotzei. Once it left Azara, now it's possible Yotzei, and now we have the limit in our brisa that tells us that there's no Isser Chametz anymore, and therefore we have the Machametz law, Lo Mechayev law, Mishum Machametz Acher Machametz. Once it already was possible Yotzei, even if you're going to take it out, even if you're going to be Mechametz it again, but you'll continue to work with the Chametz the Mincha. Maybe you'll say that since it's yotzei already, it's possible, and therefore there's no law for machmitz. Oidil makivan the chimtza possible once it already became. I'm sorry, kivan the chimtza once it became chametz kama psul yotzei loy mahanibe. Now it doesn't take on anymore the psul of yotzei, as Rashi says. Oidil makivan the chimtza loy mahanibe. The lav kedusha gemurhi. Once it became chametz, it's no longer a kedusha gemur that can become possible with yotzei, and therefore ve'ein ba ela psul chimutz. Therefore, we'll look at it like it only has the psul chimutz, not the psul yotzei. Therefore, v'chayiv b'shar kishar mechametz acher mechametz, and therefore, if you do more avodas when it's chametz, you will be chayiv. So the question is, once it becomes chametz, will it also acquire a psul of yotzei? Zok to Gemara, Oy Dilma, Kivin the Chimtza Apostle, Yosy, Kivin the Chimtza Kama, so Yosy Loy Mahanibe. The Chiyad the Machmetz law, Mechayev lo Mishum Machmetz, Acher Machmetz, the Gemara bleibt to the Tekel. Boyer Mori, what about Chimtza B'Roisha Shel Mizbeach? It says, Kol Mincha Shetakrivu. So do you say Asher Takrivu Amar Chman Bar Ikriva? Hakrivu means you brought it to the Mizbeach. You denentered it to the Mizbeach. It's on the Mizbeach. So now there is no longer an Isser of Mechametz. Or do you say it's not just bringing it up to the Mizbeach, it's Haktorah on the Mizbeach that ends the Psul Chimutz. And since you didn't do Haktorah yet, even though you're on the Mizbeach and you did Hakrova, we say that's a felt in the Hakrova until the Haktorah. Zok the Gemara, Teku. Gewaltig. Zok the Heilige Gemara weiter. The Hashto the Nafkalei, Mikol HaMincha, Asher Takrivu. Now that we learn that even if the Chametz is mixed, in other words, before you took the Kmitza, even the Mincha itself, there's an Isser to make it Chametz. So the Hashto the Nafkalei, Mikol HaMincha, comma, Asher Takrivu, Lomali. Asher Takrivu is mashma, you're going to be makriv on the Mizbeach, which is mashma, that it's only referring to the Chametz. We already learned from Kol Mincha that it's lav davke, and it means the whole Mincha is subject to the Isser Chimutz, not just the Chametz. So I bizarre, why did the Torah stick in the words Asher Takrivu? Asher Takrivu Lomali is a Gemara miboyle l'chedetanya for the following brisa. Asher Takrivu l'rabbis minchas nesachim l'chimutz. Not only is there an Isser Chimutz by all the Menachos, also for the Minchas Nesachim, which would be brought to accommodate company of carbon. Now, why should Minchas Nesachim be different? So there's a lot of talk in the Rishonim. Our Rashi over here says, because the Minchas Nesachim is Kulei Kolum, and there is no Shirayim, so it's different than another Mincha, so maybe that's why it wouldn't have the Isser Chametz. Tosfos brings a svara that because it wasn't brought with Levina, Tosfos brought another svara is that it's not brought by itself, it's brought to accompany another carbon. So there's different svaras why you might say that the Isser of Chametz, of Machmetz, would not apply to Minchas Nesachim. Kamash Mulon Asher Takrivu. Divrei Rabbi Yosy. Rabbi Akiva Omer l'Rabbis lechem aponim l'chimutz. To tell us that there's an Isser Chimutz for the lechem aponim as well. Frank the Gemara, how could you say that there's an Isser Chimutz for the Minchas Nesachim? Frankly, it's impossible for a Minchas Nesachim to become Chametz. Why is up to Gemara? Because may perishing. And Rashi explains, although all the other Menachos also have oil, but they don't have enough oil to properly make it rise. So they always mix the oil with water. So therefore, we understand why there could be chimutz. But the Minchas Nesachim had a lot of oil, and therefore they never mixed in water. So it was nilosh purely with oil. So if it's Mei Peres, and Mei Peres can become chametz. So why do I need a pasuk? Why are you going to tell me that we have a limud from a pasuk to tell us that chametz is a problem by Minchas Nesachim? It's impossible to have chametz by Minchas Nesachim. You know why? Because it's Mei Peres. Let's turn over on Tamid Beis. Umei Peres ein machmitzah. Amar Shlokish. Amar Hayu Rabbi Yosy Glili. Minchas Nesachim megavla b'mayim uksheira. They would also mix water into the Minchas Nesachim, and therefore it could become chametz. And therefore, you have a pasuk Shekrivu Hashem to include even a Minchas Nesachim to the Isser chametz. Okay, good. That answered Rabbi Yosy. What about Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva said the rabbis lechem aponim to the Isser chametz. Correct. The more lechem aponim midas yoveshu. The lechem aponim, until it's actually baked, it's not even kadosh b'kedushas aguf. Why? Because it has to be placed into a klei sharis to make it kadosh b'kedushas aguf. The only keli that they ever put the mincha into was the flour that they measured up to see if it's an isarin. They put it into the measuring cup of an isarin. But the Yisarin is a keli that was a measuring cup to measure dry goods. And those were not klisharis. And Vibal, those were not klisharis. That means the flour, until it was put into the oven, didn't have kedushas aguf. So why would there be a problem of chametz? So Frank Gemara midas yavish ushma'ana le Rabbi Kiva, and we know Rabbi Kiva holds the Yomar midas yavish lo yiskacha. Zot Gemara shlach mishmei Rabbi Yochanan. They sent over the name of Rabbi Yochanan, or shalach Rav Raven mishmei Rabbi Yochanan. Kachi atzal mishnah. In fact, we've also quoted the Mishnah as we quoted on Amud Aleph that Rabbi Yosy clearly holds it to be marba mincha tesachim, and Rabbi Kiva holds it to be marba lechem apanim. But we have got to change it. But v'epach, we have to change it, and we have to say asher takribu l'rabis lechem apanim l'chimutz divrei Rabbi Yosy Glili. It was Rabbi Yosy Glili who said l'rabis lechem apanim l'chimutz, because Rabbi Yosy Glili, he will hold that the klei yavish was a klei sharis. But Rabbi Kiva wouldn't be able to say that. And Rabbi Kiva said, "L'rabbis michas nesachim l'chilutz." The also Rabbi Yochanan l'chemei. Rabbi Yochanan flipping around the shitas of Rabbi Yosy Glili, and Rabbi Kiva actually is consistent with something else that Rabbi Yochanan said. Yom Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yosy Glili, ve'echad mitalmidei Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad. Rabbi Yosy Glili happens to agree with one of the Torah that was said by one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Yosy Glili, who said that the Midas Yavesh was a Klisharis, is consistent with a Talmud of Rabbi Shmuel. Which Talmud of Rabbi Shmuel is it consistent with? Umani Rabbi Yoshia. The Tanya we learned. It says, Vayimshachem vayikadesh oisham, referring to the Kalim by the Mizbeach in the Mishkan. The pasuk says, "Vahi b'yom kalois Moshe l'hakim es hamishkan, vayimshach oisoi, vayikadesh oisoi, v'eskol kelov, v'yas hamizbeach, v'eskol kelov, vayimshachem v'yikadesh oisoi." So he learns vayimshachem v'yikadesh oisoi is referring to the klei mizbeach. V'yosh yomer midas halach are nimshach bein mi b'fnim, bein mi b'chutz. And all the kelim that was serving the mizbech itself were called a keli halach, because those are liquids. And midas yavesh is nimshachu mibefnim, ve'ein nimshachu mibechutz. Midas yavesh is nimshach mibefnim and not nimshach mibechutz. So therefore, the midas yavesh was nimshach, although not bechutz, but it was nimshach mibefnim. Therefore, it was a klisharis, and therefore it would be Rabbi Yosy Glili who would hold that the lechem aponim would have a problem of chametz because it has kedushas aguf the moment it goes into the measuring cup. However, Rabbi Yonasan argues. Rabbi Yonasan midas halach nimshachu b'befnim ve'ein nimshachu b'bechutz. Even the midas halach, which were klisharis because they were nimshach, they were only nimshach b'befnim. And Yavesh, Midas Yavesh, Lenimshachu Kalicher. Excuse me, they were not Klisharis. They did not have the Kedusha of a Klisharis because they were not Nimshach at all. And that's who Rabbi Kiva would hold like. And therefore, it was not a Klisharis, so therefore there wouldn't be a problem of Chametz by the Lechem Aponim because it wasn't even yet Kaddish B'Kedushas Aguf until after they were baked. The oven itself was a Klisharis. Tegelach, and I'll bring you a raya. So Rabbi Yonasan wants to bring a raya that the midas yavish were not nimshachu. Sharei ein mekatres, because we know that the klei yavish, the midas yavish, are not mekadesh. Dichsiv mimosh v'yseichem taviu lechem tenufa. This is the pasuk discussing the shtel lechem. It says, bring a lechem tenufa, shtayim, 2 breads, shnei asroinim, soiles tehiyena, chametz te'afena, bikurim lashem. When does the Torah call the Shtei Alechem Mikurim Lashem? After it's Te'afena, after it was baked. That means, what about when you measure the flour out in the Keli Yisarim? How come it didn't become Kodesh Lashem at that point? Teretz is because the Keli Vais Techosh was not a Klisharis. Amos Hein Lashem only La'achar Shenefu. only after they were baked, and the oven was a clay sharis. Zok the Gemara b'may commentary. In what is the machlokas as to whether or not the clay yovesh were nimshach and they became a clay sharis or not? What is the machlokas telling you? Zok the Gemara b'oisam. So if we look back at the pasuk that we quoted a minute ago, the pasuk says, "Vayibiyam kalas Moshe l'hakim es hamishkan, vayimshach oisai." He was Moshe the Mishkan. The kadosh those days the kadosh the Mishkan. There's kol kelev and all its kelim. There's hamizbech there's kelim. This is the yimshachim and this is the kadosh oisam. Oisam is a miyut. He was mekadosh oisam dafka those. The question is how to darshan that miyut of oisam. Rabbi Yosy savar oisam lemute midas yovesh b'chutz. Oisam is memayit that midas yovesh did not receive meshicha b'chutz, only b'fnim. Rabbi Yosy savar midas yovesh choilhu. Midas yovesh is a klei choil. It doesn't need any type of meshicha if it's a klei choil. V'lo yitzrich kra lemute. I don't need oisam to be memayit a non-klei sharis. Ki yitzrich kra. So when the Torah says oisam, what is it being memayit? It's lemute midas lach mibachutz. It's to tell us that even the midas lach only got Mashiach b'fnim, but not mibachutz. Frak the Gemara, why did Rabbi Yochanan say that Rabbi Yosy Lili hold like Rabbi Yoshia? Why didn't he also say that Rabbi Kiva holds like Rabbi Yoshia? Because Rabbi Kiva holds that the Klei Yovesh were not Klei Sharis. Frak the Gemara, Lema Nami Rabbi Kiva, v'echad mitalmidei Rabbi Shmuel, Amru Davar Echad, Umani Rabbi Yoshia. Zok the Gemara, because even though in one respect Rabbi Kiva agrees with Rabbi Yoshia, but he's not in complete agreement because there's an area in which he disagrees with Rabbi Yoshia. Mishum delei shavu the midas lach la'adoti. Rabbi Yoshia said that the midas lach only got mishicha mibifnim, but Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Kiva holds that the midas lach was nimshach mibifnim and mibechutz, which Rashi says is discussed on Dav Tzadik. So that's why the Gemara, that Rabbi Yochanan never said Rabbi Kiva holds like Rabbi Yoshia because they don't totally agree. But Rabbi Yosy Lili does totally agree with Rabbi Yoshia. Amalei Pabla Abaye, but Ika Bisa Delahu. When they prepared the lechem aponim, or they prepared any part of the mincha, they had to knead it in a keli, and that keli, it was a klei sharis. So oibazoi, there should be a makom to give the mincha for the lechem aponim kedushas aguf even before the baking on the bisa on the keli in which they needed it, and that would be a klei lach. And if that's a klei lach, it's a klei sharis. So what's the whole problem that we had with Rabbi Kiva that it's not yet kadosh b'kedushas aguf because the measuring cup was not a klei sharis. True, the measuring cup wasn't, but the keli in which they needed it was a klei sharis. Amarlei, they didn't use a keli. Going shalosh al gabi ketavla. Shalosh al gabi ketavlaya. They just took a mat, like a leather mat, which is not the Makabal Tumah. I'm sorry, not that it's not Makabal Tumah, that it's not a klei sharis. They just did it on a mat, and the mat was not a klei sharis, and therefore it would not have become kadosh b'kedushas aguf. Freit the Gemara ihachi the ka'am Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yonasan said, I have a raya that the klei yovesh were not kadosh as klei sharis, and therefore they couldn't be mekadosh the flour of the shtei lechem. Why? He said teidalach. We know it's not mekadosh because he brings from the pasuk shtei lechem only becomes bikurim lashem after the afeya. The problem is leimalei going to chayla beisarain the chayil. Why what's Rabbi Yonasan's raya that the Torah only calls it bikurim lashem after the afeya? Maybe that's because he prepared it no not klei sharis. The same way you're saying that you could knead the dough of the lechem aponim on the katavlaya, which is not a klei sharis. So maybe the pasuk that says Bikurim L'Shem is because you prepare the Shtei Alechem in a kleli isarin of choil. Zakmar, that's not logical to say. Hachiach, Bishlam Abisa Lekasav Rachmona the La'avid Bisa L'Melishbei. The Torah never specifically says that you need to take a specific keli to do the lisha. The Torah does not give directive as to how the lisha could be done. So therefore, kilash law al gaba kadavlaya laslaba. There's no issue. You could make the lisha on the kadavlaya because you're not contravening any instructions that the Torah gives you. El isarin, that the Torah requires, because kibbud amar chabana over the isarin. Since the Torah tells you that you need to make the shtei alechem out of an isarin siles, so you have to put it into a measuring cup that's an isarin. So once we know you need a keli that's an isarin, shavik isarin the kodesh, b'chayal isarin the choil, no one's going to suggest that they would not use an isarin measuring cup of a klisharis and use a klechol instead. The Torah says isarin pashas means a klisharis, but the Torah never discusses specifically the lisha and how it's done. So therefore, the lisha you could learn speaking on a kadavlaya, on a non-klisharis. But once the Torah mentions isarin, it's assumed for sure that the isarin was a klisharis. Yet it doesn't become. Yet the mincha did not become the shelechem, doesn't become kodesh till after Rafiyah. So you have a right that it wasn't kodesh, kedusha klisharis to be makdish anything that's inside it with the kedusha sukkah. Tanu Rabban, minayin lemaila, mibasar chatos, mibasar osham, mibasar kachya kodeshim, mikachim kalim, umimoisar omer, umimoisar shtei alechem, umilechem aponim, umishior menachos, shu b'loisaseh. What do all these things have in common? All these things are not designed to be put on the mizbeach. They're the part that gets eaten either by the kohanim or by the bailam. So how do you know that if you put the part of the carbon that we call shirayim, that are supposed to be eaten by a person, how do we know that if you put that on the mizbeach, you're over on the loisaseh? Hamad loimer ki chol sa'or v'chol davash loisak tiru mimenu ishal Hashem. The Gemara holds that loisak tiru mimenu ishal Hashem. It already says there already is a prohibition to be makar sar and davash. So what does it mean loisak tiru mimenu ishal Hashem? So we have a special drasha. Kol shahu mimenu leishim. Any carbon that part of it was already put onto the mizbeach, or part of it is supposed to be put onto the mizbeach, and now we're looking at the shirayim harehu beval taktiru. So from loisak tiru mimenu ishal Hashem, we learn alav to put shirayim on the mizbeach. Harehu beval taktiru. Frag the Gemara. Ushtei alechem, v'lechem aponim, yesh mehen leishim. The shtei alechem and the lechem aponim, there's no part of the shtei alechem that's put on the mizbeach. There's no part of the lechem aponim that's put on the mizbeach. So why are they included in this prohibition of kol shemimenu leishim? Zok to Gemara, Batanya we learned, shtei alechem, v'lechem aponim, she'ein mehem leishim. They're not placed on the mizbeach. They themselves are not placed on the mizbeach, but they're connected to a carbon, and the carbon that they're connected to are placed on the mizbeach. You're right. It's the goof of the carbon itself doesn't go on the ishim, but they're connected to a carbon that goes to ishim. So the shtei alechem are connected to the kivsei atzeres that are placed on the mizbeach, and the lechem aponim are connected to the boziche levoina that are also placed on the mizbeach, and therefore we consider that mimenu leishim, even though it's not migufay leishim. Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayiv, Rabbi Elazar Amar pater. So we have a machloikis if you put the shtei alechem or the lechem aponim on the mizbeach, would it be chayiv or would it be pater? So Rabbi Yochanan says it will be chayiv, and Rabbi Elazar will be pater. Rabbi Yochanan Amar chayiv, the Tanya hamizbeach, ainli elamizbeach kavesh minayin. I'm sorry, I am so sorry, I skipped a line. Itmar, we have a machlokes. Hamayla bikulon al gabe kevesh. What happens if you didn't bring it onto the mizbeach? You only brought it onto the kevesh. So the question is, does the kevesh have the same din as the mizbeach, and therefore you would also be over, or is the kevesh different? So we have a machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv and Rabbi Elazar Amar Pater. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv, the Tanya we learned, ha-mizbeach, Eli ela mizbeach. Now let's have a look at these psukim that we're darshaning. So if we go back to the Torah Shalom, it says, I want to look at two psukim. One pasuk is Kol HaMizbeach. So I'm looking at Vayikra Beis Yud Aleph and Vayikra Beis Yud Beis. It says Kol HaMincha Shekrivu Hashem L'Sasa Chametz Ki Chol Zahar V'Chol Davash Lo Yisaktir Mimenu Ishal Hashem. So this first pasuk is where we learn Kol Shem Mimenu L'Ishim. There's a law to put it on the Mizbeach. And then it says Carbon Reishis Takrivu Hashem Hashem V'Yal HaMizbeach Lo Yal L'Rech Nechayach. So we learned that this pasuk is also explaining the law of the previous pasuk. And it's saying that the law of the previous pasuk of Kol Shemimenu L'Ishim only applies to Al HaMizbeach. So now we could delve into the machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. So it says Al HaMizbeach, Ainli El Mizbeach, Kevesh Minayin. How do you know that the same issue applies to the rab? Amalomer Ve'el HaMizbeach Lo Yalu L'Ratzon, which is a shaila, how you see it from there, but Rashi seems to learn it's because there's a yitor, because it already says Lo Sektir Mimenu Ishal Hashem, and then the El Mizbeach Lo Yalu L'Rech Nechayach is redundant, and from that redundancy we learn that not only does it apply only to the Mizbeach, but it also applies to the Kevesh as well. Rabbi Elazar Amar Pater, my timer, Amar Kra, Sarah Dvash. So let's look at the psukim. The psukim are first talking about Kol Sar V'Chol Davash Lo Yisaktir Mimenu Ishal Hashem, and then it goes on to the next pasuk of El Mizbeach Lo Yalu L'Rech Nechayach. So we darshan Davke Saru Davash Carbon Reishis Takrivu Oisam. So we say Oisam Hu de Ravilach Kevish Mizbeach. This Yitor of El Mizbeach Lo Yalu only applies to the Saru Davash. Davke, they have this extra halacha that the kevesh is mizbeach. So if you put sa'ar or dvash on the mizbeach, that'd be allowed. But other things that are also to place on the mizbeach, such as shirayim, that isur only applies to the mizbeach and not to the kevesh. So let's turn over on to tomorrow's daf. Rabbi Yochanan, hi Oisam, my Ovidle. What's Rabbi Yochanan going to do with the Oisam, where Rabbi Elazar learned Dafka Saru Dvash, but not other things? But Rabbi Yochanan also does apply to other things. He used Oisam to teach us another halach. Yochel Yehe Yochid Misnadevu maybe Kayotzava Nedava. You might have thought the Shtei Alechem is a communal carbon, but you might have thought that if a Yochid wants to bring a carbon called carbon Shtei Alechem and donate it to the Beis HaMikdash and they will be makaber on the Neveach, you might have thought that there is such a carbon out there, so he could do it too, and Yochid could do it as well. So Yochel Yochid Misnadevu maybe Kayotzava Nedava. And the Kairani ba motiv sachat tishmar. If somebody made such a neder, there's a chiyuv to be mekayim his neder of motiv sachat tishmar because it's a legit carbon. We are sisa Talmud Leimer carbon reaches takrivu. Tzibur oisam. So tzibur amarti lach v'lo yachid. The whole carbon reaches, which is the pasuk that we just quoted, is referring to the Shtei Alechem. That applies only to the tzibur, but it doesn't apply to a yachid. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan learns from Oisam, that the Shtei Alechem is a carbon that can only be brought by the tzibur and not by a yachid as nedava. Yochel lo yeh yachid, maybe you would have thought only a yachid can't bring it as a nedava. She'enoi maybe chayvasai kayotzeba, because there's never a point anywhere where a yachid has a chiyuv to bring Shtei Alechem. So since there's never an occurrence where he has to bring it michayva, then he can't bring it b'tersh nedava. Avol yetzibur maybe chayvasa kayotzeba. maybe the tzibur could bring additional shtei lechems as a nedava. Why? Because you find on Shavuos they have a chiyuv to bring a shtei lechem, so it's a carbon that's relevant to them. So maybe you could take from the shiur alishka, from the extra money of the lishka, instead of buying oilos for ketzim mizbeach, maybe we could buy a series of lechamim and use those as a donation from the tzibur. Hamad lemer oisam davke the shtei lechem on Shavuos as prescribed by the Torah. Those are the only shtei lechem that are brought, never anywhere else. Uma yesh lech lahavi. So what are you allowed to bring? There's a shayla for this. What is appropriate to bring? Shtei lechem in asa'or. You could bring shtei lechem out of sa'or. Ubikurim in advash. And bikurim are the only things you're allowed to bring from dvash. The only things that you're allowed to bring shtei lechem for is the mitzvah of shtei lechem, and that can even be brought chametz. And bikurim is the only presentation to the mizbeach that you could bring min advash. But other than that, kol sor b'chol dvash lo yishaktiru mimenu ishal Hashem. You're telling me that there's never a time where you could bring the shtei lechem as an nedava, but that's not true, because what tiny we learned. Im nemar kol sa'or, lama nemar kol dvash. Im nemar kol dvash, lama nemar kol sa'or. Now the Gemara later on learns a special halacha legabe achatzi kometz. What the halacha is not relevant right now. We're going to learn that later. But al kol panim, the Gemara asks, the Brisa asks, it says kol sor v'chol dvash, and we're using it to tell us you can't bring a chatzi kometz. Once it says it by sa'or, I should know it by dvash. Once the Torah says it by dvash, I should know it by sa'or. So why do I need the Torah to say this gilui of chatzi kometz side by sa'or and side by dvash? Never call sa'or, lama never call dvash. Never call dvash, lama never call sa'or. The Torah is because there's a chiddush in each one that would not apply to the other. If sheyesh b'sa'or ma'ashein b'davash, v'yesh b'davash ma'ashein b'sa'or. Sa'or hutar mechlolai b'mikdash. Sa'or, even though there's an issue to bring chametz on the mizbeach, but there's a mefurish exception to that rule, which is the shtei lechem. So therefore, something that I know from the vash, I might not know would apply to sa'or. And the vash lo yehuter mechlolai b'mikdash. And the vash you never find anywhere where you're allowed to be makrib vash in the Beis Hamikdash. On the other hand, the vash huter b'shiyar menachos. The shiraim of the menachos that the kohanim eat, they're allowed to prepare it any way they want, including they could mix honey into their shiyar menachos. But sa'or lo yehuter b'shiyar menachos. We know it's also even the shiraim of the mincha you're not allowed to let it become chametz. So therefore, since they're each unique, the Torah has to specify sa'or and davash for the halacha about the chatzi kometz. But the problem is, hamipnei sheyesh b'sa'or ma she'ein b'dvash v'yesh b'dvash ma she'ein b'sa'or hutzrach loymar. Therefore, the Torah needed to say kol sa'or v'hutzrach loymar kol davash. V'balt each one has its own chubra or its own kula. Therefore, the Torah needed to teach us the same halacha, side by sa'or and side by dvash. So, frank the Gemara, sa'or the hutter mechlole b'mikdash shmayni. It says in the Brisa that sa'or you sometimes find that it's mutter to be brought in the Beis Hamikdash. What is an example of when sa'or can be brought in the Beis Hamikdash? Lav shtei alechem, the korban nedava, must be referring to shtei alechem that's brought b'nedava. So you're going to ask yourself, why should we say it's referring to the dava? Maybe it's referring to the shtei alechem itself. Zok Rashi, no. The ima hanach the chayva, the pasuk can't be referring. The Brisa can't be referring to the sa'or of chayva. You know why? Lo yimot tilamemar. The lehuter b'mikdash. The lekarav l'mizbeach. The shtei alechem that was brought on Shavuos was given to the kohanim. It was never placed on the mizbeach. So you don't see that sa'or is mutar l'mizbeach. But if we're suggesting that you could bring dafka two lechem as a korban nedava, those would be placed on the mizbeach. So it must be, since you find in the Brisa that sa'or sometimes is hutar l'mizbeach, it must be referring to the nedava of a shtei alechem. So you have a raya that the shtei alechem could be brought min nedava. No, that's not how you would fatach the brisa. It's likarib imahem. It is referring to achiv. And when we say that sa'or could be placed on the mizbeach, we don't mean mamish the sa'or itself is placed on the mizbeach, like the shtei alechem. Rather, we mean the carbon that's affiliated with the chametz stika carbon, meaning the kvas, the kivsei atzeres, that are connected to the shtei alechem. Those are brought on the mizbeach. So if that's the case, how do you know that dvash is allowed to be eaten with the shirayim? By bikurim, you could say the same thing, that it's only what's brought along with the bikurim, along with the dvash. The Tanakh we learned, hagazolish el gabe hasalin hayu oilos v'shabiyodam. There's a shayla few verses hasalin v'shabiyodam nitin l'kayanim. So it's mashma that there were birds that were also given to the kohen along with the payers, and maybe that's where you're allowed to maybe that's where maybe you don't have a raya that you could v'kurim nami shayu mevi'in imoyin oifos. So oibazoi, maybe that's what it's referring to when we say that sometimes there's dvash. It doesn't literally mean that you can mix dvash in. Maybe it just means that the birds that come with the bikurim, those they're allowed to eat. But you never see that they can mix dvash into their kabbanis. Zok Gemara, there's a very big difference between bikurim and the shtei alechem that are accompanied by the kivsei atzeres. Zok to Gemara, lost the place. Zok to Gemara, Hanu la'ater bikur mudasu. B'ishleim the karbonis, the kivsei atzeres that comes along with the shtei alechem. That's part and parcel of the carbon. So you could say that the brisa means that sometimes sa'or is on the mizbeach because the kivsei atzeres that are connected to the shtei alechem, they're brought on the mizbeach. But the fact that the oifos, the kohanim could eat and mix it with other things, and as part of the bikurim, that wouldn't be a raya that they can use dvash, because dvash and the oifos, they're not part and parcel of the same thing. It was just an extra bonus to be mechabed bikurim. They brought birds with it, but it's not mamish part of the carbon of bikurim, and therefore you don't have a raya. Okay, we will stop here, Be'ez Hashem, and we will be mamshech tomorrow. Everybody should have an awesomely wonderful day.
See, where is everybody?
I do not know where everybody is.
Are they still sleeping an hour behind?